Okay, so the last time when I left off on the Conquest, I had just finished up my motor mounts, and before that I had built my transmission crossmember in the rear. So now that the engine and transmission is completely mounted, the next step is going to be do the rack and pinion swap. So the rack is already under the car now, and I'm going to go ahead and show you what I've got planned for that, and then we'll talk about why I'm doing the rack and pinion swap and some of the parts that I'm going to use for the swap. Alright, so right now I got the rack and pinion behind me just mocked into place using the bottle jacks, and I got it pretty much where I want it to be. It's low enough to where I don't have any clearance issues with the engines, and it's high enough to be tucked up out of the way from, when I'm driving, so it don't get hung up on anything. In fact, you can probably see that the oil pan is lower than the rack and pinion anyway, and for now I'm planning on using a skid plate. So I did go ahead and cut the lip off of the back of the engine cross member, and there was about a 1-inch lip that stuck out towards the back of the car, and by cutting it off it allowed me to push the rack forward some, and that'll give me just a little bit more ackerman. So since the rack is where I want it, now I got to figure out how to mount it. There's two holes right here, these little kind of built-in brackets on the rack itself. And then on the other end, traditionally you have like a clamp that goes around the rack, and then it has like a rubber isolator that holds it. I'm just going to mount this solid. A lot of people run solid like aluminum bushings in their racks anyways, so there shouldn't be any adverse effects to it other than just a little bit more road noise coming through the steering wheel. Okay, so before I start mounting the rack in the car, I wanted to talk about sort of the benefits of a rack and pinion swap and why I'm doing it. And also go over the hardware of what I'm using for the swap. So the main reason I'm doing this swap is just to free up some room. So on this recirculating ball style system that the car had originally, this set up on the frame rail like this, and then the steering column was ran directly into here, and then the pitman arm is bolted to the bottom of this steering box, and it moved back and forth the center link and that turned the tie rods. You had this idler arm right here to keep the other side of the center link basically the same as the pitman arm. It's just like a dummy pitman arm that stabilizes the other end of the center link, and that pushes the tires back and forth to turn the car. The same thing happens in the rack and pinion, but instead of having this big thing and a center link and all of that, the steering column is ran into this, and you turn it, and it turns the tie rods, pushes them back and forth, and that turns the car. So it's really a lot simpler system, and it's a lot more modern. So without this big gearbox sitting up on the frame rail right beside the motor, it freed up a ton of room, and I was actually able to move the engine over some and down some. It's still offset about 5/8 of an inch. In this car, it's already sort of tight on the passenger side for header clearance, and I want to get full long tube headers in here. So getting rid of that freed up room for the headers on the driver's side, and I was able to move the engine over, and I got a lot more room for headers on the passenger side as well. I mentioned the other benefit earlier, and that is simplicity. It doesn't have all of these joints and arms and everything that the whole recirculating ball system has, and that's going to tighten up the steering a lot more, and there's a lot less failure points for anything to go wrong. And the simplicity of this design also means it weighs a lot less, and that's the third benefit. That's why I borrowed my sister's bathroom scale here, because I just wanted to compare the weights of this system versus this system. So I'm going to do that real quick. Put the cardboard on here so maybe she won't know that I borrowed it. Of course, unless she watches this video. The steering box itself is 22 pounds. Let's see if I can add all of this on top of here. Fold it in on itself. I can do this. I think everything's off the ground. 12.8, basically 13 pounds. So that's about 35 pounds worth of stuff right here. It's actually a little less than I thought it would be. This steering box felt a lot heavier than that. So now let's see how the rack and pinion setup is. I'm adding this steering shaft here because since the column went directly into there, we're going to have to add a shaft to the system. This shaft is obviously way too long, but I just wanted to add a little extra weight in here, so not a completely accurate representation. So this whole setup is 23 pounds. So, you know, it's not a lot of difference, but every little bit counts. And shedding 12 pounds off of the front of the car, especially since we added probably at least 100 pounds, probably close to 150 pounds to the front of this thing just by swapping the engines, that 12 pounds is going to help a lot. So now let's talk about setup here. First thing, the rack itself is from an '89 Dodge Shadow, and if you're looking to do this, try to get the firm feel suspension rack. That was a option in the Dodge Shadows, usually like the Shelby and Turbo Shadows, and it had a 14:1 ratio rack. The biggest thing to look for when you're doing a rack and pinion swap on another car is the distance between the inner tie rods. So it needs to match as closely as possible to the distance between the inner pivots on the control arms. And this car has very long control arms under it, but it has a pretty narrow track, so it's sort of hard to find a rack that'll work. I've seen other guys use a Porsche 944 rack and also S13, 240 Nissan racks. And those will work. They're just a little bit more expensive, and I think that they're not even as fast a ratio as this rack. And I've seen this done before in Conquest and Starions, so this one should work for me. And it's a Mopar. Pretty much everything so far has been Mopar parts, so I'm kind of partial to Mopars. The next thing is the tie rod ends. These aren't what I'm going to use. These are from like a 99 Neon, and they would work. I would probably have to shorten the inner tie rod ends here that come with the rack some to run these. But the taper on the end of the tie rod end that actually goes into the steering arm that's bolted to the knuckle of the car, that is wrong. It's a little bit smaller, and I'm pretty sure the angle of the taper itself is not right. I could remount that, but instead of doing that, I'm trying to use a bump steer correction setup. So what that means is the bump steer will be adjustable, and that way I can dial in the bump steer and I won't have to worry about that, even if I lower the car, which I want to do in the future. And then I mentioned earlier that I'm going to have to go from the steering column to the rack with the shaft. This is just normal 3/4 inch double D shaft. I went with a stainless shaft because I'm probably going to be running the headers around the shaft itself, and they're stainless headers, so I kind of wanted it to look cool, but it'll also keep it from corroding with all the heat of the headers going around them. I had this stainless double D universal joint already, and so I was going to be using that. That should hook to the column. And then here, this rack uses a 36 spline 3/4, and this U-joint goes from the 3/4 double D to the 36 spline. So that's pretty much it for all the hardware we're using. Got some parts ordered for the bump steer kit, so we're going to talk more about that later. Now it's time to figure out what type of brackets we need to bolt this thing to the car. Okay, so this is what I've come up with using my patented plywood aided design here. This is going to space away from the engine cross member, and then this bit here will get welded directly to the cross member on the bottom side. So this is going to hang down a little bit. I'm going to be giving up just a bit of ground clearance, but really the oil pan, which sits about right here, it actually hangs down a little farther anyway, so I was going to put a skid plate, and this will be where the backside of the skid plate mounts. So this will actually serve a few purposes. Not only will it be the mount for the rack and pinion and the mount for the rear skid plate, it'll also stiffen things up a bit for the engine cross member, and that's also where the lower control arms bolt and everything. So it's going to make this a good bit stronger. These 2x4s here will be made out of just normal square tubing. It's like 1.5 inches by 2. And then I'll use the 3/16 plate to build the rest. This piece, I'll probably try to machine this out of aluminum. I haven't worked with aluminum much, and I don't have any true machining tools other than like a drill press. But I'm going to try to make this as best as I can just using the tools I have. And I got some aluminum on the way. It should be here in the next few days. So I'm going to go ahead and weld up the metal pieces to make this piece, and then while that's cooling down, I'm going to start taking out this front crossmember. Okay, so I got the mount for my rack and pinion all welded up, and I went ahead and pulled the front cross member or K-member, whatever you want to call it, out of the car. And just like a K-member on like a Mustang or a Mopar, this thing does a lot of different jobs. Number one is it holds the engine in place. You know, this is where my motor mounts bolt to. Also, the lower control arms bolt to this. And it ties the front subframe together also. So the front two frame rails, it bolts in between them, and it kind of keeps them stabilized. So this really needs to be fairly strong. And so what I did to help it strengthen it up, other than doing this, I also welded all of this. This was just held on with like normal spot welds. So I decided to go ahead and seam weld everything up and do a couple more welds under here just to make it a little bit stronger and less flexible. So what I'm going to do now is flip it over, get everything squared up and, you know, level and everything, and weld this on, and then I'll be able to actually bolt the rack and pinion to the car. While I'm waiting on a few things to come in to finish mounting the rack to the front cross member, I need to go ahead and figure out what I need to do to connect the steering column to the rack. And I showed you earlier I had a couple U-joints and some 3/4 double D shaft, and one U-joint is already connects to the rack, and the other U-joint will connect to the double D shaft, but the thing I have to do now is figure out how to connect the end of that U-joint to the steering column. So what I did, I went ahead and cut this off. It had like a factory coupler, and I cut all of that off, and that coupler went directly to the steering box, so obviously it wouldn't work. So it has this funky end right here, and I think the best thing to do will just be to cut this off and then weld a little 3/4 double D stub on this, so that the U-joint will just slide up on this and we can tighten it down, and everything should be ready to go once I cut the shaft to length in between this and the rack. Okay, so I had a little bit of change of plans here. I realized that I could actually loosen up this clamp here by loosening these two bolts, and this piece here just kind of slides out, and it can actually slide down on farther into the steering column. And so I was able to slide it down, and then instead of cutting it off and adding a stub, I went ahead and cut off an extra 1/2 inch or so, and then I cut flats into the shaft itself. And then I just kind of ground it down, made sure it was a good tight fit in the U-joint. And so it ended up being about 1.5 inches shorter from where it would have been if I just cut off that end and then added some double D shaft. And I was able to do that because I'm recessing the firewall, and the firewall will be recessed about 1.5 inches anyway. So since it'll be about 1.5 inches shorter, that's going to help with my U-joint angles, because the shaft was going to be at a pretty steep angle, and it still is. But that extra 1.5 inches is going to help it a good bit to keep these at least at a reasonable angle. That way there won't be any binding or anything on the U-joints. Alright, so the last week or so I've been waiting on some parts to come in, and I've been making sure I have all the parts to build the car, or at least most of the parts, to get some progress done. And I took the time while I was waiting on the parts to come in to finish building the motor just so it's ready to go. Didn't get a lot of footage of that because it's just, you know, putting in push rods and rocker arms, valve covers, things like that. The one thing I was waiting on was this aluminum block. I got a big hunk of aluminum, and we're going to use it to build the clamp, and then that will clamp around the rack and pinion and then bolt to the new mount that I made. I mentioned earlier I haven't worked with aluminum a lot. I probably have more experience with aluminum working with pools than I do with working with cars. We use aluminum coping and liner track and stuff. One thing I have learned from doing that is aluminum cuts well with like woodworking tools, and it works better than like normal steel tools, you know, metal tools, because when you're working with steel, you want a lot of teeth on the saw blades, and then you can use abrasives. When you're working with aluminum, a lot of times I'll just gall up, and it'll, you know, try to clog your, you know, sandpaper or your abrasives, and then it'll clog up all the little teeth and all. on if you're using like a saw blade. So what I used to cut this was just like a normal woodworking miter saw, and we have a miter saw set up to cut plywood and 2x4s. I just used the blade that we had on it, which was a 12-inch 80-tooth blade, so it's like 6 teeth per inch, and it worked really well. I made sure I clamped it down good, and then I used like some WD-40 or any type of lubricant. With the fast blade speed, it cuts really well. Just go slow whenever you're going down and give it a liberal amount of lubricant, and it worked really well. As you can see, it cut straight, good angles. So the next thing will be to mark my holes, drill straight through the block that way, and then I can dog ear it and recess the bolt holes and all that. Alright, now I've got a couple pilot holes drilled in this. I used an extra long drill bit. One problem I had is just trying to keep the drill bit clean, so that's the problem you're going to have drilling aluminum. Number one, you need to use a good bit of pressure. Unlike steel, the more pressure you use, kind of the better it digs, and the less it's going to gall up. And then once it does like clog up, you have to take the bit out, clean it up. So it takes a little more time drilling through thick aluminum like this, especially this thick. I went ahead and used a short drill bit first, and then that way I had a good straight pilot hole, and then I used an extra long bit to finish it out. The next thing I need to do is go ahead and clearance for my nuts. I want them to be recessed down into this even after I dog ear it. So I've got this. Once again, this is made for wood, but what this should do is it's kind of square and flat, unlike a normal drill bit, which is tapered. And this should recess the holes and give it kind of a shoulder and a flat place for the washer and nut to sit down in the material. And I want to go ahead and do it now. I may not go all the way because I don't really know how much it needs to be recessed, but I'll get a hole started with this small pilot hole because it fits the point on this pretty well, so there's no movement. And once this gets down in there, then the outside will act kind of as a pilot hole. Alright, so I'm drilling out the second side now, and I did have to sharpen the bit some. I just did it with a grinder and it's working pretty good. But I had to up the bit speed. I normally keep this drill press at a pretty low speed because it's kind of junky and the belt slips most of the time. But I ended up upping the speed, and it's making it drill a whole lot better. It's still taking some time. As you can see, I can't put a whole lot of pressure on it because it just stops the bit. But still, with the high speed and a good bit of pressure, it goes right through it pretty quick. Alright, so this is where I'm at so far. I clearanced everything for the nuts and bolts that's going to go in through here. And I went ahead and drilled it all the way through for the 7/16 bolt, and I also dog eared it, and I drilled a hole for the vent line that runs between the two boots on the rack. So the next thing to do is drill the hole in here for the rack, and it'll basically be done. Obviously I got to cut it in order to split this and get the rack inside it, so I need to do that first because if I don't do that first, then after I cut it, the kerf of the blade, which is the material that the blade takes out, will make the hole oblong, so it'll be kind of binding down on the rack and trying to squeeze it too much. I want a little bit of an interference fit just so it actually holds it in place. But if I cut it first, bolt it together, then drill my hole, I know my hole's round. And if the hole's a little too big, I can take some material off and make it squeeze down on it a little harder. If the hole's too small, then I can just, hone out the hole a little bit. So I need to cut it, bolt it together, and then we'll drill the hole for the rack. Alright, so now that I got the hole drilled in this aluminum bracket, I'm able to actually mount the rack to the front cross member, and I've set it up to where I can run a bolt all the way through here, through the bottom plate, and then whenever I tighten these down, it tightens down on the clamp and it bolts it to this plate here. So put these two bolts in and then these two bolts, and it's not going anywhere. This part's done. The only thing left to do on the rack swap is, of course, cutting the shaft to length here and getting that hooked up. And then over here, you can see I've got my rod ends in here, and then I went ahead and drilled out this steering arm to accept the 14mm bolt. The only thing I have to do now to finish that part is I need to make a few spacers to go in between here. I'm going to use like varying thicknesses of spacers to tune in the bump steer. So by changing the height here and changing the angle of the tie rod in relation to the lower control arm and the ground and everything, you can vary how much bump steer that it's going to have at varying ride heights. So I'll be able to tune the bump steer to where I want it now, and also later whenever I put coilovers on the car and lower it, I'll be able to tune the bump steer then also. And whatever ride height I choose, I can put different spacers in there to tune out as much bump steer as possible. Also, while I had all this out, I replaced the lower control arm bushings. They needed it anyway, so I found some polyurethane bushings online. I eventually want to replace these lower control arms with a tubular version, but I'll probably have to build that myself, so for now this will work. And I also did new lower ball joints. With all that done, now it's time to get this back in the car and then put the motor in the car. Of course, finish up the steering shaft, and then I'll get to building headers. Alright, so before I can start building my headers, I need to know exactly where my steering shaft is going to be because the headers are going to have to be built around that shaft. So I cut a shaft to length and then mounted it between the steering column and the rack and pinion. But I ran into a little issue because originally the steering box located the front side of the steering shaft, so the steering box was mounted directly to the chassis, and then the steering column went onto the steering box, and that kind of located everything, left to right. And then you have this mount right here that locates everything up on this end of the steering column. But without the box there and with just a shaft with a couple U-joints, you could just take the wheel and move it around whichever way you wanted to move it. So to solve that issue, I made a little bracket that clamps to the steering column on the front side, and then it comes up and mounts to the brake pedal mount. And the brake pedal mount bolts to the firewall where the master cylinder goes, and it also bolts right here where the steering column is mounted on the back side. So that's a really strong place because everything's bolted to each other and it's all sort of triangulated together. And as you can see, it's just as strong as it was when the steering box was up there and it was mounted to it. So that solved that issue, and now the steering shaft is exactly where it's going to be when everything is said and done, so I can build my headers around it and I shouldn't have any clearance issues. Alright, so that's pretty much it for the rack and pinion swap. Everything seems to be working fine. There's no binding in the U-joints or anything. So I still have to make my spacers for the bump steer correction, but we'll get that done before the car gets on the road. The ratio is about 2 1/4 turns lock to lock, which I think is plenty fast for what I'm going to be doing with the car, and it's still not too fast so it won't be twitchy going down the highway. And I'm happy with my Ackerman angles too. I've got a little more Ackerman than stock, and I mentioned Ackerman at the beginning of the video. All that is when the inside tire is turning a little more than the outside tire, since they're traveling at 2 different radiuses. And this, I measured it before I started, and the car stock had a little less than 100% Ackerman, which means the inside tire was kind of trying to push the outside tire a little bit. Not too much. It didn't have anti-Ackerman, which means that it's actually trying to travel at a wider radius than the outside tire, but it had just a little less pro Ackerman than what I thought it needed. So I added a little more, and I think that's going to help me in the tighter radius turns on autocross and things like that. So that's it for part 3 of the Conquest, and part 4 will be out very soon if it isn't already, and that is the full equal length long tube header build. So keep an eye out for that. In the meantime, you can check us out on social media. I'm at NickFerris53. You can also find Racing Rejects at Racing Rejects on Instagram and Facebook. And if you want to email us for any reason, we are theracerrejects@gmail.com. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.